No compromise. That's how the Kremlin characterized hours of talks between US and Russian representatives in Moscow this week. And after returning from their US Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff has turned his attention straight away to upcoming talks that he'll now have with Ukrainians in Miami. But Volodymyr Zelensky has warned that this diplomatic back and forth could now lead to President Trump losing interest if progress continues to elude his top team.
We don't trust the words. It doesn't matter they are good words or bad words. If you don't trust, it doesn't matter for me. But we're afraid if America will be tired. Of course, it's not good for us. It's the goal of Russians to withdraw interests of America from this situation. And this is their goal.
So as Vladimir Putin accelerates his re-emergence on the world stage with a 2-day trip to India, will Washington's attempts to quicken the pace of diplomacy bear any fruit? We'll be answering your questions on all of that and more with our expert panel.
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
I'm Laura Gozzi.
I'm James Landale.
And I'm Lucy Hockings. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
So as the team were recording the podcast on Tuesday, of course, we had Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner at the Kremlin for talks. And then really we had quite a lot of mixed messaging on what the actual outcome of those talks were. But what we do know is there doesn't appear to be any evidence of major progress. But Vitaly, just take us through where we're at and what we did learn.
After those talks, everyone's been really, really tight-lipped. To give an idea, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, he said that the more quiet surrounds the talks, the more effective they are. We don't really know what they agreed, if anything. We have a reasonably good idea of what they discussed, which is possible Ukrainian territorial concessions, trade between Russia and America, chances or no chances of Ukraine joining NATO, because that's what the debate has been revolving around, and that's what Yuri Ushakov, the key advisor, foreign policy advisor to Vladimir Putin, that's what he said as well. But I think it's worth remembering how unusual the whole situation is. These two envoys, they don't really have much or any diplomatic experience or much knowledge of the area. That is unusual, wouldn't you say, James, as a diplomatic?
Remind us how this would normally work, high-level talks like this.
I mean, throughout this entire process, not just in the last few days, but in recent months, there's a lack of technical expertise here. So a lack of note takers, a lack of officials and civil servants, diplomats, the people who sort of keep diplomacy going, keeping an accurate record of who said what to whom so they can report back. Everybody knows wherever. So throughout this process, there have been occasions when there's been muddles, where Russia has felt it's delivered a message and that's not reported back correctly to the Americans, and then the Europeans are getting, and then you sometimes get different nations relying on their own intelligence assessments of what each side has said to try to work out. This is really strange. Normally with peace negotiations or ceasefire negotiations, these are detailed, they're long, they take many, many weeks, months. You think of all the negotiations to end the war in the former Yugoslavia. These things take time. The idea that it's sorted with just a few meetings with some individuals shuttling between the Oval Office and the Kremlin, is unusual.
Those mixed messages, Laura, you can also see, coming from Dmitry Peskov, who said it wouldn't be correct to say, actually, that President Putin rejected US proposals for peace.
I mean, that's, as Vitaly was saying, that's part of keeping very tight-lipped, isn't it? Other things that Russian officials said this week was that things, peace was neither further nor nearer than it had been before. So in other words, nothing much had changed. But I think to James's point about how extraordinary this whole process is, I was watching events in Moscow on Tuesday, and as the American envoys arrived, they were taken out to dine at a luxury restaurant in Moscow, and then they were shown around a Christmas market on Red Square. And pretty much at the exact same time, Putin was speaking to reporters, basically talking about how Russia would be prepared to fight Europe if it needed to. And I just had these two, I just had a split screen on my computer and I was watching both these things happening pretty much in real time. And I just thought how extraordinary that, Putin could be talking in these terms about Europe, or Europeans, the Americans, supposedly closest partners. And at the same time, these Americans were waiting for him, and he kept them waiting for quite a long time to hold these, on the face of it, very cordial talks. So the whole process and even the optics of it is quite unusual and extraordinary.
In terms of the diplomacy, talks now move back to Miami, back to Florida, with Steve Witkoff going on to meet with the Ukrainians on Thursday. We've had that confirmation from the White House. But let's get on to some of your questions now. Thank you so much for sending them in. We really appreciate it. Paul has what sounds like a pretty simple question. They're often the hardest ones to answer, of course. But he says, Putin says that Ukraine should never join NATO because he does not want NATO on the border with Russia. But Russia already has 5 NATO members on the border: Norway, Finland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. So how is this one of his objections? Laura?
Well, so it's true that Russia does have long borders with NATO, though some, for instance, Norway and Estonia's are very small. Finland's is long, but, it's quite far from Russian cities. So perhaps there's an argument to be made that, even in the event of an attack, that would be, it would be further removed from big populated Russian centers. But those are kind of the material angles. I think really what this is about, and what it's always been about, is that Ukraine occupies a very different position in Putin's mind. In his head, Ukraine is Russia's sphere of influence, so historically, culturally, and we've heard him say over and over that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, that Ukraine should have never been independent, and that any alignment of Ukraine with the West is unacceptable. So really, other countries that may be part of NATO just don't hold the same weight in his mind. And I think it was interesting last week, European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen basically made a reference to this when she talked about how Putin had moved on from a Yalta mentality, so from a post-World War II mentality, in which the European continent was something to be carved up into spheres of influence. And I think that is still actually probably the way he operates.
It's always been a red herring, really. The year Vladimir Putin came to power in the year 2000, he said that actually Russia could join NATO. After the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, he wasn't that concerned about NATO being right on Russia's border. In 2023, when Finland joined NATO, he said, no, that's not a problem at all. Ukraine, meanwhile, which, let's be frank, never really was on the brink of joining the alliance. That's a massive no-no for Vladimir Putin. And it's an excuse that he's used to justify his invasion of that country.
We should remember NATO's border with Russia doubled since the full-scale invasion because of Finland becoming a member. But let's talk a bit more now about diplomacy, because we talk a lot about defence capabilities as well, how difficult it would be for Europe particularly to match what the US is providing to Ukraine in terms of defence capability. But we've got a question now about diplomacy. And Kieran asks, recently I have been feeling that the US is getting in the way of a peace deal instead of enabling one. So I wonder whether it would be possible for Europe to take a lead in the process. This is about European security and European money. So why should Europe not take the lead? I recognise also that US military support is required, but now it seems that Europe is paying for most of that anyway. Is there leadership in Europe to make this happen? James?
Well, the short answer to the last question is no at the moment. I think the Europeans are under a huge amount of pressure to step up in a way that they haven't. And it's one complaint you hear from the Americans that I think the Europeans know holds a bit of weight. So the Americans will say, come on, Europe, use those frozen assets, make a decision about what you're going to do with that. Come on, Europe, spend more on your own defence. Not just in terms of, your own defence, but also building up your defence capabilities so that you can support Ukraine in the long run. Because even if there were a ceasefire, even if this conflict comes to some kind of an end or reaches some kind of a status quo, Europe is going to be having to support Ukraine with materiel and intelligence for many years to come to deter a future Russian aggression. That requires Europe to step up. If in the short term, the Americans were to pull out and were to sort of say, to brush their hands of this whole kind of thing, then there would be even more pressure on Europe to step up. The problem is that Europe, in theory, has the economic and defence potential to support. But at the moment, the point is we talk about Europe, but Europe is divided into many nations. They think differently. They have different priorities. Not all of them share the same views when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And so, it's very, very difficult.
And in places like Italy, we're really starting to see sort of growing dissent.
I was actually thinking about that exactly because I think it's such a good example of where we're at, almost 4 years into the war. Essentially, Italy this week delayed passing a decree on continued military support for Ukraine, which it's had since 22. Now, it will probably pass it by the end of the year. There's no, in my view, there's no real risk of that not going through. But I think the very fact that within the government coalition, which is Giorgia Meloni's right-wing government, that within that coalition, there's some factions that are beginning to really drag their feet on, sending more weapons to Ukraine. I think it is telling of what is going on in quite a lot of European countries at the moment, because 4 years is a long time. There's no clear progress or peace process, indeed, on the cards. And particularly, I think with the recent corruption scandals in Ukraine, which we've talked about, there are some parts of the European electorate that are beginning to wonder where exactly is our money going. And I know in Italy, this is a conversation that people are having on a certain end of the political spectrum. And again, this decree will pass, and Italy, I think, will continue to supply weapons to Ukraine. But the fact that the conversation has bubbled up to this level, I think, for Ukrainians is actually quite concerning.
Well, let's stay with some of the questions being asked around Europe, with Leon asking us, at a time when the US may reduce its military support for Ukraine, responsibility for further military support would consequently fall increasingly to the major European powers, the UK, France and Germany. Could you address the main characteristics and differences of the French, German and British militaries?
Yeah, the old gag was that in Europe, in recent decades, the Germans sorted the money and the French sorted out the military. That is being turned on its head at the moment by massive defence spending by Germany at the moment. So that is the sort of the changing dynamic that we're seeing, is that the Germans are spending more on defence. For years, their army, while the Bundeswehr was not, how can I put it politely, held up as the finest fighting force in the world. But I think that is changing now. The Poles are way ahead of the Germans on this. The Poles are now heading to spending 4.7% of their GDP on defence at the moment. So the Poles are the coming army at the moment, definitely. The French and the Brits are obviously, nuclear armed, but their armies are smaller than they were. And the key thing to understand in answer to this question, though, is the relative size of the armies in Europe is actually not the key issue in terms of how many soldiers, personnel they've got. If the Americans were to withdraw their military support, the key question would be, does Europe have the air defence missiles to allow Ukraine to protect its cities? Does it have the long-range missiles to allow Ukraine to target deep within Russia? And does it have the industrial base to keep providing Ukraine with shells and finance so that it can build up its drone industry and all of those kind of things? On top of which is the question of intelligence. Because at the moment, the key thing that the Americans do militarily is they are giving real, live, military intelligence to the Ukrainians, and that allows the Ukrainians to better defend themselves from incoming Russian attacks, but also it gives the Ukrainians the intelligence that allows them to target Russian air bases and oil energy targets within Russia. If the Americans were to withdraw that, the Europeans would really struggle to replace that, because that requires satellite enabling capability that the Europeans would really struggle to match.
We've been doing a little bit of research as well on this, to the point that you mentioned about how much European militaries still rely hugely on the US, particularly when it comes to air capability. I mean, this is really interesting. Studies suggesting that across the EU, Britain and Norway, for instance, 46% of fighter jets are American-made and 42% of missile systems.
Yeah.
The US, absolutely vital.
And the thing is, a lot of those jets rely on daily computer updates from the United States. And there's a risk that if the Americans were to in any way disrupt that flow of data, that potentially could have a huge impact on the capabilities.
Fiona, thank you so much for your question, which we're going to talk about now, which is about life in Ukraine at the moment. James, I know you've just come back, so you could answer perhaps this first one, and obviously Vitaly will come to you because you're talking to people there every day, friends and family. But Fiona says, I'd like an update about living conditions in Ukraine. What's it like for the BBC team when the air raid sirens go off and you have to seek shelter? How do you cope with the lack of sleep? How much is the power supply affected? And how are people managing?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the BBC staff and the team there, we are hugely fortunate, and we have it good compared to a lot of other people in Ukraine, both civilians and military. So, that's just to establish that. We are in a nice building, hotel. There is security, there is an international presence there, so it's unlikely, one would assume, to be a target. There's a very large basement downstairs to keep people safe. There are generators so that if the power supply is cut, there is energy. In terms of the sort of the daily life, it goes through periods where there's calmer periods and more noisy periods. Most nights there are sirens, so most nights sleep is broken and you have to get up and or at least roll over and look at your phone, and you get a certain amount of data that tells you what the scale of the threat is and how serious it is. Then, if you look at that and you think, okay, well, I better get out of bed, you wander over, peek through the curtains, and if you see explosions on the horizon, it's probably air defences. It's probably on the margin, so you can probably go back to bed. I mean, this is a personal decision. Everybody has to make their own decision. If there's sort of noise above you and if the windows are rattling a bit, then probably it's best to go down to the shelter. But the thing is that if you're a civilian, you're sitting there at home. You don't have a big shelter downstairs. So what you do is you go to the bathroom, is the phrase. In other words, you move to a room that is probably in the middle of your building rather than the outside. Some people take their sleeping bags and they move into the stairwell of their flats, which is cold, it's freezing cold, but it's safer.
The way Ukrainian cities are set up, they rely on the old Soviet concept of central heating, where there's a huge power plant which then pumps hot water into your high-rise buildings. Unlike this country, there are many more high-rise apartment blocks in Ukraine. If you look at a Ukraine city, it's mostly apartment blocks. So once that power plant goes, that means a lot of people are without heating. If electricity goes, and in some parts of Ukraine they only have electricity for a few hours a day, you not only lose your lights, your lifts are not working. So what if you have small children? How do you take them downstairs and back upstairs? So there's this daily pressure on Ukrainians. And while we've been talking so much about Pokrovsk, that town in eastern Donbass region, which I think is gone, its strategic significance as a transport hub is gone. They're now fighting over the ruins. I think the next possible big tragic story out of Ukraine is Zaporizhia, because the Russians are literally down the road from this enormously big city, which is more than 10 times bigger than Pokrovsk and bigger than Kherson. Hundreds of thousands of people are still there. They've been using FPV drones against Zaporizhia already, which is a massive escalation. So things are getting worse for that part of Ukraine as well.
And Vitaly, can I get a quick answer from you as well? Because Fiona has a second part to her question. It is an interesting one about the agriculture sector. She said that she'd heard that it had been a really awful year for Ukrainian farmers and wanted to know if that was due to bad weather or other factors, and whether grain is still being exported via the Black Sea.
It is, Fiona. They're still doing it, despite Russia saying, oh no, without our permission, you will not be able to use all those routes in the Black Sea, but it's still happening. Just in this year, I've got some figures here: 7.2 million tons of wheat being exported out of Ukraine, which is 18% less than last year. So the fighting still has an enormous impact on agriculture in Ukraine. They're still trying to do it, but it's getting more difficult.
Just one small point. In the big square in the centre of Ukraine by St Michael's Cathedral, where they have all a sort of constant demonstration of tanks and armoured vehicles and things that have been destroyed. It's a sort of constant rolling exhibition. When I was last there, I noticed that there was a combine harvester. Also part of the exhibition that had been destroyed. And there is some suggestion that occasionally the Russians target agricultural products if they have a chance. And because as you drive through Ukraine, quite often you go through the towns, and on the outskirts of the towns there'll be these massive parking lots, with rows and rows of combine harvesters. They're all there waiting for the summer and the harvest. But just one missile in the middle of that would have a substantial impact on the harvest.
Just to add to that, one thing I've been researching recently is the landmines in Ukraine and how heavily mined so much of Ukrainian farmland now is. And it was so striking to me just, to read stats on the percentage of farmland that is not usable now, that will not be usable for a really long time until it's demined. I mean, these are, even if the war was to end today, it would take decades for so much of what used to be, Ukraine's heartland to be usable in that way again.
Okay, final question we've got from Ed, who asks, how are the oligarchs coping with the various sanctions? Imagining the previous lifestyles that they've had been impacted, or have they been, with limitations on travel and availability of luxury commodities? Is there resentment building up? Have they found ways around it and changed habits? How patient would they be? Are there kids at school overseas, etc.? And it would be very interesting, he says, to get your views on this. Vitaly.
They're doing really well. In fact, if you look at the Forbes list of billionaires, there are now more Russian billionaires than before the war. In fact, right now, there's the highest ever number of Russian billionaires, 146. And their combined wealth is higher than at any point in history, which means that despite all the efforts taken by the West to try sort of prise them away from Vladimir Putin and sanction them, possibly in the hope that they would start thinking, oh, maybe Vladimir Putin's policy is harming us, maybe we should get rid of him. That's not working. In fact, these sanctions have pushed a lot of these quote-unquote oligarchs back to Vladimir Putin. To give you an idea of how it works, there was this banker called Oleg Dinkov, who shortly after the war started, or the full-scale invasion started, who posted something critical against the war on Instagram. The following day, somebody from the Kremlin got in touch with his managers of his bank and told them, look, if you don't lose any association with Oleg Dinkov, you are in trouble. He was forced to sell his bank at, he says, at 3% of its real value. He lost $9 billion. And he's
post, $9 billion.
That's right. That's probably the most expensive post on Instagram ever. He's left Russia. He denounced Russian citizenship, saying he doesn't want to be associated with that country. So that just shows how things work in Russia. And one final point, I don't think oligarchs exist in Russia anymore, because the word oligarchs implies that they're both rich and powerful. Under Vladimir Putin, they're getting richer, but they've lost almost all of their political clout.
Very interesting point to end on. Thank you all very much. And thank you so much for watching. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode next week. Don't forget to check out our Ukrainecast feed, though, wherever you get your podcasts. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.